was bookkeeper, assistant bookkeeper at the Bryan Street Church. So she's kind of a numbers gal. And I think I just won't go into a long detailed introduction. Y'all know her. We're here to talk about her wartime experiences in the military. Lucy, during World War II, there was a draft where able-bodied men, some right out of high school, were called to serve in the military, but there was no draft for women.
No, there was not.
Was it common for women to volunteer?
Not particularly. I didn't know many who did, although I went to volunteer with two friends for the Navy, but they took them but refused me.
And why was that?
Because of my eyes.
She didn't have enough.
She's one big
You
one.
still need to be closer
You need
to
to
the
get like an ice cream cone.
Yes.
Sure, I go on her, you're going to ask me some
Oh, I'll ask you lots of questions. We have scripts here just to keep us moving. I just wanted to know what made you volunteer, sign up, enlist.
Well, I had been a year at college and was not happy enough there to go back. And I had just turned 20, which you had to have your parents' consent at that time. And my friends were going, so I went with them to the Navy. And then after that, I was encouraged by my family, who had somebody in every war that ever fought in this country. And I was the only one of the right age at this point. And so I went and was accepted by the Army. And since my father's business partner was a retired Army Air Colonel, he encouraged me to join the Air Corps, Army Air Corps. And I was known as an air whack. And
what year was this?
this was in 43.
1943.
1943. And I was sworn in the summer, but it was not until fall that I was sent for basic training. You want me to just go on?
I can ask you questions and then we'll cover all this stuff. What was your reaction to going into that particular branch of the service rather than into the other choices?
There we go.
What was the reaction? Told me that there was a good thing about it.
Well, it turned out to be very blessing because only the Army was sent overseas, except for nurses, of course. And so I had the opportunity of going overseas. But for my basic training, I was sent in the middle of winter to Des Moines, Iowa. And being a California native, this was quite a change. And it was an old cavalry base, but we would give our basic training there. And from there, I was sent to Stout Field outside of Indianapolis, which was a lighter base. But I was only there for a couple of months. And then I went to Sacramento, California, which was a fighter training base. But then it was taken over by the Air Transport Command, ATC, and became the base for the B-29s. And of course we were all sworn, we were all top secret people at that point, except everybody in Sacramento knew about the B-29s. They were pious as they flew over. And they went on from there to the Pacific to eventually bomb Japan. And then from there, ATC is the group that sent me overseas. And I went to New Hampshire over the Christmas winter season again for overseas training which involved long hikes with heavy packs. And there we want to tell you about a Christian Science coordinator for the base who took a few of us who were Christian Scientists to Boston to visit Mary Bigger's places and took us to church and even had us for Christmas dinner. And from there, I went overseas on the Mariposa, which was a Matson liner. And it was one of only 3 ships that could go unescorted because they were fast enough to avoid submarines. Everybody else, all other ships went in transports, large
Convoys? Convoys?
Convoys, yes. But these 3 ships, the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mary, and the Mariposa, were fast enough to avoid submarines, which on one occasion we did, and we were able to outrun it. And on this ship, there were about 200 women and about 8,000 men. And we were segregated, of course, and we women had an entire deck to ourselves. And we could look down on 8,000 men trying to get on one deck. And when I got to Europe, I landed at Wales, in England, and I was based at Wales, which is the place that Prince Philip was just stationed at.
Before you get to Wales, there was one thing that I thought you told me that was interesting, and that was how you bathed on board ship.
In our helmets.
The helmets.
Yes.
The helmet was her bathtub.
But I was fortunate on the ship because of the 12 of us in our cabin. Cabins are usually 2 when it's a passenger ship. There was one girl who sang beautifully, and she sang over the ship radio. And as a result, we had the pleasure of having fresh water to bathe in, whereas others had salt water.
Okay, now going back to North Wales, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
In North Wales, there was one of the things back when I was stationed in Sacramento. My ship went from 2 until, it was the swing shift, and I didn't get off work until after 2. But then in the morning I was expected to get up at 6 to do calisthenics, but I didn't always do that. So I ended up with a lot of gigs, they were called. And my job was to pick up the cigarette butts from all the smokers. They'd probably be the only one who didn't smoke. And that was kind of a mess. And then when I was in Wales, I had another cigarette experience. The cigarettes, of course, were rationed. But I had a boyfriend who also did not smoke. And so he was able to trade with the local farmers cigarettes for fresh eggs. And all we had to eat usually was powdered egg and powdered milk. And the fresh eggs were a blessing to my particular barrack, which consisted of about 20 people. And we had pot-bellied stoves, and we used those to cook our eggs. And they were, I was very popular as you saw. And
what was your title?
I was a dispatcher in operations. And so our base was the nearest one to the States. And all the ships, all the planes that came into our base. And then we distributed them to the other bases around England. And then within a couple of months, we were doing just the reverse. They were coming to our base, and these as the war was over. They were coming to our base and being sent back to the U.S. to go to the Pacific. While I was in that valley, I was on a 4-day pass to England, or to London, with 3 friends. And that's when, as we were traveling on the 8-hour train trip, we began to see flags appearing in the various backyards. And one little English boy kept running into our cabin and saying something that we didn't really understand. Then finally dawned on us that the war had ended in Europe. And so on VE Day, I spent in London, which was really something, because the lights, gas lamps were coming on for the first time in many years, and everybody was out, and they were throwing the buckets of sand down, and it was quite hectic. And the dance hall opened for the first time in all those years. And in London, it was quite something. In touring St. Paul, you could see there was some damage, but it was still standing. And all the surrounding country was just flat and well cleaned up, but everything was gone. But St. Paul just stood up proudly. And I, of course, went to all of and I saw the Queen and King out saluting the crowd at the end of the war. And it was really a very exciting time. And after VJ Day, I was transferred to a base right out of Bovingdon, which was the airport, which was right outside of London. So I got into London quite a bit. And at that base, I saw Eisenhower among other people. And then we really had horrible quarters there, very small Nissan huts or Quonset huts, whichever way each country calls it. And there were only about 8 of us, but we're back to bathing out of our helmet. And in order to get to the mess hall, we had to go through a cattle patch. Fortunately, by then we could use flashlights, but we were cattle pasture, cow debris everywhere. And then we went from this rather primitive station to complete luxury. I was sent to Paris, and we were put up in a very deluxe hotel. We had maid service, and we had waiters in the kitchen with tablecloths and the whole bit, very army. And that was my last stop before coming home. And as I left England, a group of my friends had left a week earlier, but for some reason their ship had trouble, and they ended up on the Azores for 2 months, and I got home long before they did. And I landed in New Jersey, and then was flown to California. And it took me a week to fly to California from New Jersey. In those days, I didn't fly at night, so I stopped a couple places. And one of the places was Dallas. And it snowed for 3 days, so we couldn't get up again. And at that time, a popular song was "Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow." And all of us who were stuck there were a little unhappy about that. Then I landed at Mather Field, which is outside. And Mather Field was my original station. This was Camp Beale, where I had my discharge. And then home.
Are there any questions? Loudly. sand? You said so many buckets of
The,
sand.
What was that about?
they kept buckets of sand to throw on fires.
So they were finally done with those.
They were finally done with those.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks.
Other question, Julie?
In Sacramento, was it McClellan Air Force Base or Mather?
Where were you at Sacramento? What was the base where you
McClellan or
were?
Mather?
I was at Mather Field.
Mather,
What?
oh, thank you. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Elizabeth. And now, Elisabeth Seaman, and she needs no prompting from me, and an introduction only. Elisabeth Seaman, longtime friend.
Hi, yes. I'm basically giving you the talk that I gave in Germany in October at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp memorial. But I was thinking, especially as listening to the lesson this morning, that there is a hymn that means a lot to me that kind of relates to this. And it's 135. I know no life divided, O Lord, of life from thee. In thee is life provided for all mankind and me. I know no death, O Father, because I live in thee. Thy life it is that frees us from death eternally. But that did not seem to be the case for my family and me back in the 1940s in Holland. And this is where I'd say that if you have small children, you may not want to have them in the room at the moment. I had originally called this Death and Dying or Life and Living. And I just, with World War II then, my first experience with death was pretty devastating. It took place when I was 6 years old during the last months of World War II. Waking up in the mornings in the women's and children's barracks, I would look out from the window that was near our bunks and would look out on corpses that were piled upon each other. And they were along the wall of the nearest barracks section, and I think they were divided, these sections, by barbed wire. And as a child, of course, this felt just awful, and I couldn't understand how this could be. How could that be? And my next experience with death was at the end of my father's life, also in Bergen-Belsen in January 1945. My father had been ill and confined to an infirmary. I don't know what his ailment was. And at that time, my mother had had some kind of surgery. It was rather crudely done because there were not proper medical facilities. This was on her feet, and she couldn't walk and couldn't go to see my father. So she'd send me to go and see him in January. This apparently was one of the coldest winters in Germany in 1945. And I'd go there to this infirmary and try to talk with my father. And he wouldn't respond, and my mother would ask me what had he said, and I said, well, nothing. He seemed to be asleep. And finally, one day, my mother was able to go to see my father. And while she was visiting him, she had to take a bathroom break, and when she returned, he had passed on. I don't remember how I reacted at that time, but I know that I felt his loss for a long time, and even for decades. And for many years, I had an irrational anger at my father for having died. And these things, I guess, happen sometimes with kids. I thought that the German men were raised to be responsible for their family. So how could my father have given up and died and left us? To some extent, I held on to those feelings and for well into adulthood, although I didn't think about it often. Then an eye-opener occurred when, I'd say maybe about 30 years ago, less than that, I took a class at the local community college on Introduction to Philosophy. And in that class, we read in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and some of you may be familiar with that. And he was an Austrian psychiatrist, and he was also in many of the, or several of the Nazi concentration camps. And his observations about the impact of these situations and living in those situations really opened my eyes to seeing that my father was not a perpetrator, he was a victim of this whole situation. And many years later, well, and that made me really feel at peace then, and it took that to get me there. And many years later, I found penciled notes on small bits of paper which my father had written to my mother while we were in the camp. And in those, it was evident that he often took care of me and just loved me dearly and tried to give me food that had come in packages from relatives. And in the notes also, he was obviously looking forward to liberation and that hopefully another child might be added to the family after that. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and my parents really only had 10 years together. And my mother never did remarry, but I wear their wedding rings. So let's get back to see how we got into this situation. When my parents fled Germany shortly before the war started in Europe, they moved to Holland because that was a neutral country, and but that didn't deter the Germans because the Nazis overran it in 1940 in a matter of 5 days. And so my grandparents had also, my father's parents had also joined us in Holland. And during the years leading up to 1944, or 43 even, we had to move several times. And one morning in the spring of 1943, I woke up and I found that my grandparents were gone. And where were the grandparents? Well, the Dutch Gestapo had come during the night and had taken them away. And my father had protested and said, well, what do you want with these old people? They were in their 70s and 80s. And they said, well, shut up or we'll take the rest of your family too. And we never saw them again. They were sent almost immediately to gas chambers at Sobibor in Poland. And very shortly after, within a matter of days, Honduran passports arrived for all our family because my grandmother's brother in Switzerland had managed to secure these for all of our family members. And although those didn't save my grandparents, they may have played a good role in preserving our lives and my father's up to the time that he did pass on, because we were sent to a special section of this camp which was intended for exchanging prisoners for German prisoners of war. In April of 1944, my parents were on their way to Amsterdam and were arrested and imprisoned for 10 days before being taken to Westerbork, which was the transit camp in the Netherlands to any other Nazi concentration camps. The day after my parents had been arrested, I was also arrested and at age 5 felt very frightened when I was cloistered overnight in a cellar with a lot of strangers. Those around tried to help comfort me and as best they could. And I don't really have very complete memories of this whole period, and I've had to reconstruct quite a bit over time. My mother was very open and willing to talk about her experiences and our experiences, but I never wanted to talk about it. I said, oh, the past is past, and now we're living our lives, and forget about this. And I really only wanted to talk with her after I had read Frankel's book and had asked her if she'd read it and if then we could talk about it. And unfortunately, she passed on. Just then I found the book on her nightstand. And so where I could have gotten direct information, I didn't. But over the years, I've pieced things together. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, got some documents that gave me additional information. After about 5 days in West Vesterbork, and this is one of those pieces of information I only got a couple of days ago. I never knew how long we'd been there, only I figured it must have been pretty short. Then we were deported to Bergen-Belsen, and some of you may have heard that name. Most people have heard of Auschwitz or Dachau, but Bergen-Belsen was a pretty bad place too, and that's the one where Anne Frank died, and you may have known of that. One of the things that I do remember was that extreme cold during roll call or appel, and if you've seen Schindler's List, you've seen pictures of that. I felt that the ice must have been at least a foot thick in order, and standing there as a child for hours. Children under 4 didn't have to do this, but by that time I was 5 and 6. And when I saw that movie, I was shocked into remembrance about the multi-level bunks that we slept in, and very hard, and well, not exactly that 5-star hotel that you were in Paris. Anyway, I also kind of remembered that they would bring a pot with food, kind of a watery stew, into the middle of the barracks that we were in. And it seemed to me that the thing I most remembered that was in that was rutabagas. And so I would not eat that or cook that later on. But one day once I had a family and we were living around here, I thought, oh, this is ridiculous, you know, get over it already. So I bought some rutabagas and I cooked them, and as the smell came up, I just couldn't do it. And apparently the sense of smell is one that brings back memories, so I'm told, so I didn't try that experiment again. I don't really recall how I spent the days as a child in the camp. The schooling was not allowed. I think there was always some woman who was to be in charge of the children who stayed behind while the others were sent to slave labor of one sort or another. And I think maybe they tried to do something with us in the way of teaching or games, but I don't really recall that. I do remember that in the summer, if it got warm, that there would be tar that melted from the roof, and we'd take some and form little shapes or do something with that. And at one point, my mother worked in a place where there was cellophane. I just learned this last year that they made parachutes there. And she would smuggle a little bit of that into a pocket and bring it back and shape a little doll or something for me out of that. I also remember that once in a while, I don't know if it was once a month or what, we were taken to a place for showers, and I don't know if we went by truck or if we walked or how that went. And they were big rooms with ceiling showers attached, and I think that maybe they fumigated our clothes during that time too, and we were always bothered by lice, head lice and body lice, and that was a constant there. And food got to be less and less as the camp got to be fuller and fuller. It was intended for a certain amount of people. I don't really remember the numbers now. And it got to be totally crammed and food withheld. So we'd get maybe a loaf of bread that was per person that was to last a week, and then this kind of watery soup, and not very much. People really were starving there, and it was riddled with typhus and typhoid fever, and bad place. But by early April 1945, it appeared that the Allies were becoming stronger and the Nazis were going to lose the war. So someone in power decided that this camp would be emptied of a portion of the prisoners to not make it look quite so bad. And about 7,000 people were deported on 3 trains going in different directions. And our train held about 2,500 people. Some, especially the sick people and children, were put in a few passenger cars, and the others jammed into cattle cars. And very little food, practically nothing in the way of sanitary facilities, a lot of people sick and dying, so pretty horrible situation there. But the Allies had been bombing the area, and after a while of being on the tracks, the train really couldn't move forward anymore and was stuck at a place called Farsleben, a little town outside a little town. And some of us got out of the train. My mother was very weak. She was down to about 70 pounds and very ill, and I guess I was maybe not quite that bad. And it was a beautiful spring day, and it was kind of a green hillside, wildflowers, and this was just amazing and wonderful in contrast to just black, white, and gray memories I had of the camp. I did have some notion that the buildings there were kind of a green, and which later on was verified that was the case. And later on in recent years, when I met some of the other people who'd been on that train, another one verified for me, yes, that's what the scene was like, that I did remember. But there were still some German soldiers around, and they had us get back in the train, which made me pretty sad. And soon after that, some American infantrymen came in a couple of tanks along there. They were headed across the Elbe River, and I think headed for Berlin. And they came upon this train that was stuck there, and these stragglers, these people outside trying to make fires and see what roots they could pull up for food and berries and so on. And they were just totally amazed. And these Americans were the ones who liberated us. And I still choke up. Anyway, this was just amazing. Here we suddenly were considered free. But they didn't know what to do with us. And there were just these 3 men in the tanks, and 2 of them I've had the great pleasure of meeting and thanking and hugging them. It was wonderful. A 3rd one had passed on by that time. And this was just in the last 7 years, I guess, 6 years or so. Anyway, one or 2 of them went back to their headquarters, or where they were in Germany, not far from there, and brought back others from their infantry division. And those who were capable, who could do that, they put into homes in that area, and then also into a medical facility like a field hospital and others, where my mother and I were. And my mother and I were there until July 1945, at which point we were repatriated to the Netherlands. And from there on, life became a better picture. We were there for some time, and then I started school September 45 in the same little town where we had been before. And the next year, in March, we went to London, where my grandmother and aunt and her husband lived. They had fled from Germany in 1938, I think, and gone there. And my mother hadn't seen her mother since that time. And while we were there, my uncle Rudy, who was my mother's brother, came from El Salvador and joined us there too. He lived there since the 1920s on behalf of my grandfather's international trade business, particularly in this case coffee. And he invited my mother to go with me back with him. And I don't know if they had arranged this beforehand. I think maybe from something I saw on a passport, they may have arranged this before. To go back with him, and maybe we'd stay a few months till my mother got back on her feet and decided what to do with her life. And a few months turned into 7 years. She got work there, first with an American agency and then with another large company with which her father had done business too, because she was trained in business and she knew 5 languages, so she was able to use that. And I went to the American school and learned English and Spanish, and continued with German. My mother had me have some German lessons at some point, and forgot the Dutch. And it's kind of not too far. They're similar to English and I mean especially German and some English. So occasionally I recognize a word. Anyway, from there life went on to Berkeley, and I went to high school there and to the University of California. Married, had 4 kids. Found Christian Science, and then later on also, I think because of this early history I was led to go into mediation and do that kind of peace work. And that's been a blessing, and it's been really pretty wonderful all around. I've been working in this field of conflict resolution now for over 30 years. And I attribute my success in this work that I've learned to see individuals as capable and caring and intelligent and genuine, the way that God made each of us. And Christian Science certainly has played a large role in my life and in my work. And that's been a tremendous blessing. And as a peacemaker, it's now my intention to not stereotype or demonize individuals or groups of individuals as a result of actions taken by a subgroup of those people. You know, like, you know, demonize all the Germans because of what the Nazis did, and the leaders and those who willingly followed them. And just like I recognize that the horrors committed by the terrorists on 9/11, again, don't reflect the vast majority of Muslims who, like most of us, are peace-loving people. And those who misuse the teachings of their religion to harm us, to harm and manipulate others, are not representatives of the larger group of that religion. And as a peacemaker, I enjoy facilitating, teaching, and helping others to resolve their conflicts in peaceful, non-adversarial ways. And I feel that every day, in small and large ways, we have the opportunity to transcend past mistakes and misjudgments and misunderstandings, and to work together to create peace and harmony. And peace often seems elusive, especially on the world scene. However, as the lyrics of the popular song suggest, let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. And I was also thinking today of the first hymn we sang, that Mrs. Eddy's poem, Love, thou to whose power our hope we give, free us from human strife. Fed by thy love divine, we live, for love alone is life, and life most sweet as heart to heart speaks kindly when we meet and part. Thank you.
Some of you may need to leave. Those of you who have questions, Elisabeth is willing to stay and answer your questions.
And also at the table at the back there are some pictures and some documents and things you may want to take a look at. And you're welcome to look at those.
One last thing, thank you to Wendy, who got us all set up and is going to take the microphones away from us. But I do thank her because she knew how to do things I didn't. So thank you all for coming.
Family had dissociated themselves from the Jewish community because at that time in Germany, people then legally no longer had to declare a particular faith, which they did have to up till then, and then they no longer did. But if you have names like Rosenthal and Goldschmidt, then you know that pegs you as Jewish, and so yeah. Yes.
How long from the time they took you until you were out? What time?
It was just over a year. We were exactly a year in the camp, and but with time in Holland also maybe it was another week or 2 weeks, something like that. So it was just over a year, the last year of the war.
Can you talk a bit about, you told me before, the full story of the train that you were on and what its ultimate destination could have been?
Well, it was intended to go to Terezin in what was then Czechoslovakia. And there was another camp there, and I don't know, but also there was a rumor that the train was going to be blown up on a bridge that was over the river Elbe. And my mother had mentioned this to me at one time, and then I found among her papers a newspaper article that had been written by, or was an interview with a woman who'd been on that train too, who had spoken with the conductor of the train at the time, and had supposedly told her this. So,
Interesting.
yeah. Someone else had a hand up? Yes.
I was curious if you, you said you didn't have a lot of memories as a child in the camp, but do you recall, like, the other children or games you might have played, or?
No, I really don't have any recollection of the other children. I recollect one time there was a teenage girl who one evening, I think, came into the barracks screaming because her mother had gotten too close to the fence and either was electrified, but I guess there are always guard towers along the fence, and I think that she'd been shot. But I don't remember what we did with the other kids, and I've asked some of these others because I've had occasion to meet some others who are about my age who were on that train, and no, they didn't either. Yeah. Anything else? If not, happy Sunday, Super Bowl, and whatever else you're doing. I'm not, but